So welcome everybody. My name is Patrick Heller. I'm a professor of sociology at Brown University and speaking to you from the great state of Rhode Island on the East Coast. I know many of you are participating from other time zones, so whether it's morning, afternoon, or evening, welcome everyone. Welcome to SASE and welcome to this panel where we're going to have Atul Kohli speaking about his latest book on imperialism, with a fantastic set of critics, as we call them. And I want to get started immediately, but just very briefly say that each of our speakers will have 10 minutes. We're going to start with Atul, who I'll introduce in a moment, and then go through our panelists and finish hopefully within 40 or 50 minutes, at which point we'll give Atul a few minutes to respond to the commentaries. And then we will open it up for discussion. And depending on the numbers, and if we stay at these numbers, I think we'll be able to have people participate directly and just unmute themselves and ask questions. But you should also feel free to send questions via the comment box. I will monitor those and will share them with all of you as they come in or at the appropriate time. And if you do want to speak during the open session, you can if you're on camera, you can wave at me, but you can also just raise your hand and I will call on you. So before we get started from the panelists, do we have any questions? I think we've had a little time to get organized here, so we should be ready to go. All right. So on that note, let me begin by introducing Atul and our panelists. As you all know, Atul is a professor at Princeton University who has worked on questions of development and democracy for a long time. His work on Indian democracy is absolutely seminal, and those of us who work on India are all deeply familiar with his work. But he's also done a lot of work on comparative political economy. And today, Atul is going to be speaking to us about his latest book, which I have here, Imperialism and the Developing World, How Britain and the United States Shaped the Global Periphery. And I think we all recognize this is an incredibly important topic, and we're really excited that Atul today is going to be telling us about the work he's done on imperialism. We have a really extraordinary panel. I think Nitsan Korev, who's the president of SASE, has joined us. But Nitsan organized this panel, and it's an absolutely fantastic panel because we have scholars who've all worked on questions related to imperialism and development, but from very different angles. First is Jason Jackson. Jason is an assistant professor of political economy and urban planning at MIT. And Jason is doing work on states and markets in the 19th century with a particular interest in India. So I'm sure he'll have some very detailed things to say about Atul's work. Our second commentator is Katrina Quisumbing King, who is joining us from Los Angeles, where she has been a postdoc at USC, I think for the last 2 years. Is that right? Yeah. And will be starting a fantastic job in the Department of Sociology at Northwestern in the fall. And Katrina works on issues of race and citizenship and how those are shaped and impacted by empire. And her work is focused mostly on the Philippines, but she's also done some work on race in the United States. Our third presenter will be Sarah Babb. Sarah Babb is a professor of sociology at Boston College. And she's joining us from Boston. And those of you who work in the field of development, you all know Sarah's work. She's written books on the developmental banks, and most recently has written a book on IRBs, and has contributed a lot of substantive and theoretical work to our understanding of comparative development. So I think this is an incredibly exciting topic and a fantastic panel. And with no further ado, I'm going to ask Atul. I have to make his presentation. I'm going to share Atul's presentation on my screen. And I just got to make sure I get the right presentation. And Atul, you can see your slide, your first slide.
I can, Patrick. Thank you.
Okay, Atul, over to you.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Thank you for taking time to join us. I'm excited to hear your feedback. This is much more your chance to tell me what I have done wrong, and I'm happy to learn. So let me just take very few minutes to introduce the book in 10 minutes. And Patrick, if I'm going beyond 8 minutes, just raise your 2-minute finger, please. So the book which I'm introducing is a study, if you like, of both causes and consequences of modern imperialism. The focus is on British imperialism in the 19th century and American imperialism in the 20th century. And the dynamics of both formal empire or colonialism and informal empire are analyzed. So that's broadly the scope. Patrick, second slide, please. Thank you, Patrick. So it's a long book. Here's a quick look at the table of contents. It begins with the East India Company and ends with US intervention in Iraq. So about the first half of the book is on British imperialism, and the second half of the book is on American imperialism. And if you just look at that table of content, you will notice a variety of cases across the developing world are analyzed. And so I'm going to just tell you the summary of the argument. Of course, I'm not going to touch any on the empirical materials at all. And if some questions come up about some specific empirics, I'll be happy to answer that. So I'm going to tell you the core argument of causes, the core argument about impact, and some comparative insights. And so those are the next 3 slides to introduce you to the book. Next slide, Patrick, please. So one central theme that runs throughout the book is, of course, what are the causes of imperialism? Why do imperialists imperialize? As most of you know, debates on the topic are legion. Marxists, liberals, realists have all their own views, and the topic has been debated ad nauseum. And so you may wonder, why write another book about it? I think I have something new to add. My core argument is that the taproot of imperialism, invoking the term from Schumpeter, is the desire of hegemonic powers to enhance their national economic prosperity. That's the key phrase, national economic prosperity. The main mechanism by which advanced industrial countries, capitalist hegemonic countries do so is by undermining sovereignty in peripheral countries, and they do this so as to establish open economic access. So the key theoretical intuition that runs throughout the book is that national economic prosperity, which is the goal advanced capitalist countries seek, is both an end in itself, but it is also a means to power. And in this important sense, the drive for imperialism is both economic and political. For those of you who work on this subject will readily recognize that the argument is in dialogue with both Marxists and realists from the international relations side. It suggests the motives are both economic and political, and the effort, to the extent that it contributes something new, is to see how the two interact and transcend these old divides between those who suggest state security and those who suggest profits of capitalists drive imperialism. So the effort is to marry and transcend those two when it comes to causes of imperialism. Next slide, please, Patrick. The second theme that runs throughout the volume is what is the impact of imperialism? As I said at the beginning, the book is both about causes and consequences. So those are the two key themes. On consequences, the book suggests in very broad terms that the impact is negative. That's not news to anybody who sort of studies these subjects, except for a handful of champions on empire. Most people will not be surprised by that argument. But the implications and nuances are what matters. So the central argument of the study is that in a world of states, national sovereignty is an economic asset. And since imperialism seeks to limit the sovereign power of subject people, there tends to be an inverse relationship between imperialism and development. So I argue throughout the book that the less control a state has over its own affairs, the less likely it is that the people of that state will experience steady, inclusive economic progress. Now, I don't need to add this, but I will. National sovereignty may not be sufficient to put a country on a path to progress. Many African cases highlight that, but it is often a necessary precondition, I argue, throughout the book. And for specialists, this argument is in dialogue with both dependency scholars as well as with pro-globalization scholars. And instead of those traditional well-established arguments, I make a case for state-led development, importance of sovereignty, and effective states. Last slide, please, Patrick. So causes and consequences are the two general themes that run throughout the book, and I trace those across cases, but a variety of sub-themes emerge when you juxtapose cases. And I cannot go into all the sub-themes that emerge, but I picked out three to give you a sense of sort of the texture of the book, that it doesn't only generalize across cases, it compares and contrasts cases also. And so these three I like, so I picked them. There are numerous others. I, of course, want you to read the book. And so I throw these out as teasers so that you will have enough interest to explore them further. So the first insight, a comparative insight that emerges, is by juxtaposing British versus American empire. What's the difference? Not every, causes and consequences, I'm generalizing across cases, but there are many differences. One big difference that stands out when you juxtapose British and American cases is I suggest that Britain needed an empire, but the United States merely wanted one. This is an important distinction. It emerges from the fact that Britain was an island economy. It desperately needed the empire to sustain its industrial revolution. By contrast, the United States is a continental economy, relatively self-sufficient. It did not need the empire to the same degree, but it wanted one. And I explain what the difference is in more detail, but one of the important implications that flow from suggesting a contrast like that is a very noticeable difference. Namely, the British seldom disagreed among each other about the desirability of imperialism. There was enormous consensus in the political class that Britain needed an empire. The Americans have never agreed about it. They have always disagreed about the need for empire. It's because they wanted it, and some benefited rather than the nation as a whole benefited. And so you get a sense of disagreement anywhere from early acquisition of Cuba and Philippines down to Vietnam through Iraq. The United States has always, American elite have been divided on the importance of imperialism. So that's one type of contrast. A different type of comparative insight that emerges in the book is what's the difference between formal versus informal empire. Those of you who work in this field will recognize Gallagher and Robinson's name. They are famous scholars for introducing the concept of informal empire. And their argument about Britain was that on balance, especially after, say, Corn Laws, when Britain becomes quite capitalist, that Britain preferred informal empire. The implication is that mature capitalist economy really don't need colonialism, that was a product of mercantilist age. I argue against that view based on the historical evidence I have accumulated. My overall suggestion is that both the United States and Britain, on balance, prefer more political control than less, but settle for less because they often run into opposition, either domestic or global. And finally, to finish my 10 minutes, I'm able to show that impact of colonialism and informal empire more or less varies along the dimension of degree of political control. So formal colonialism is the worst from the point of view of global periphery. Informal empire does a little better, at least is able to create and sustain elite incomes on the global periphery, as well as some economic growth. And finally, if you really want inclusive development in the modern world, the evidence seems to suggest that this sort of is stimulated by sovereign and effective states, especially if you juxtapose variety of Asian cases to modern Latin American cases. This proposition seems to be supported. I'm going to stop here and let others take over. Thank you, Patrick.
Thank you, Atul, and thank you for being so disciplined, for summarizing a book that runs just past 500 pages in exactly 10 minutes. That was the perfect way to kick off this conversation. Jason, I'm gonna ask that you be next. You need to unmute yourself, and the floor is yours. Jason.
Great, excellent. Thanks very much, Patrick. And mostly, of course, well, thanks to the organizers, thanks to Nitsan for putting this panel together and having me on it as well. But of course, most of all, thanks very much to Atul for writing this book. So as Patrick mentioned in his introduction, I, along with many others, have long been a fan of Atul's work and have benefited significantly from it in a whole variety of ways. So thanks very much for the opportunity to comment on this most recent volume. So what I thought that I would do is just highlight one kind of area that I thought about really around nationalism and the role of third world nationalism and nationalisms, which plays an important role in several parts of the book. And so most of my questions really are going to focus there. I'm going to ask two questions that center on this issue of nationalism, and then I'll have one small question on settler colonialism and so forth. But first, let me just say, I really appreciate the focus in the book on the role of states and power, contra much of the focus, as Atul notes in the book, on realist perspectives, dependency perspectives, especially in the more IR literature. But then also, and I'll bring in this in a moment, literatures in sociology that focus on global society and so forth. So I really appreciate this kind of focusing on states and power, which is surprisingly underplayed. On one hand, it would seem sort of obvious to sort of think about the role of states and power in the context of imperialism. But in reading the book, I'm completely convinced that it's actually significantly underplayed in the literature. And I think this is one of the many important contributions that the book makes. Okay, so let me turn to my questions on nationalism. So I really would love to get your thoughts on the extent to which you see nationalism as determined by types of imperialism. So in a number of parts of the book, you talk about, of course, the big distinction that you draw between formal and informal modes of imperialism. But I'm curious to get this extent to which you see this distinction as driving the kinds of nationalisms that emerge in the third world, in the global periphery. So for example, one of the key arguments that you make really centers on the extent to which under formal or informal modes of imperialism, the colonizer established strong state institutions. So the best example here that you give, or the strong example that you give in the book rather, is of course the Indian one. The creation of the IAS and the railroads, I think, are the two key institutions and sort of structural formations that you describe. And certainly the contrast there, for example, with Nigeria that you give is completely convincing. So I completely buy that the importance of this question of cohesion and fragmentation. At the same time, though, I should just go a little bit further. So the argument, just for those who may not have got into the detail of the book, the argument that Atul makes is that under formal colonialism, such as the British had in India, you get a cohesive form of state presence on one hand, or colonial presence on one hand, that also generates a much more cohesive kind of nationalist response. By contrast, under informal colonialism, for example, in Nigeria, you get fragmentation. You have a weak colonial sort of institutional setup, on the ground, so to speak, in country. And also you get a fragmented kind of nationalism, sort of fragmented modes of governance through local collaborators. And this also contributes to the development, well, this is kind of my question, the extent to which this contributes to the development of a fragmented kind of nationalist response. That's my understanding of the argument, which I buy. However, at the same time, I do wonder how much scope there is, how much agency there is, how many sort of degrees of freedom, I suppose, so to speak, do nationalist elites have in constructing a nationalist response. That is, to what extent is this distinction between a cohesive and a fragmented kind of nationalism completely determined by the type of imperialist strategy that is put into play, formal versus informal? So I especially ask for a couple of questions. So one is because you do center the role of state elites in the global periphery, the interests and so forth that they respond to, in particular interests aligned with different factions of capital, as important in the development of nationalism. And so I'm very curious, this is especially around page 199, 200. So I'm especially curious to get a sense of how much we should think about the kind of response, how much agency nationalists have in response. So let me go a little bit further in this and draw on another part of the argument that you make, especially when you push back against the story of global capitalism as coming from dependentistas, dependency theory, and in particular Wallerstein, which I think is the key figure that you highlight here. So to the extent that dependency theory and sort of theories from Wallerstein and so forth really highlight, the importance of structural global economic forces, I agree with you the pushback on the role of states and power. So I'm completely on board there. However, at the same time, I wonder to what extent the global may be overly played down in the volume. So let me give an example of what I mean. So I wonder, for example, about the kinds of global exchanges of ideas, for example, between emerging nationalist elites in the global periphery. I would say probably especially around the early to mid-century, depending, of course, of which which third world country context we're thinking about. So here I'm thinking about the extent to which national elites like Nehru, but obviously many others as well, studied in Europe, traveled extensively across Europe, sometimes to the United States, other parts of Asia, but also crucially interacted with other nationalist elites as well. So the Asian emergent nationalists from across the Asian continent, so South Asian, Southeast Asian, interacting with African counterparts, and also interestingly interacting with Americans as well, both Americans who were key figures in the development of nationalist thought on one hand, as well as Americans who were thinking about sort of Black nationalism in the American context as well. And since I'm from Jamaica, I also have to note as well, you also had nationalist elites coming, or sorry, emergent nationalist thinkers coming from the Caribbean as well. So lots of interplay between these different kinds of thinkers. And so I'm just curious as to what extent you see this perhaps playing a role in the kind of nationalist response that was generated, and ultimately what implications this had for the kinds of imperialism that we see on the ground. So do we see any agency, creativity, et cetera, amongst these kinds of nationalists as they interact with each other in London, in Paris, in New York, and so forth? So that's my main sort of comments and questions. And then, as I mentioned, just one very small final one, just to close, which is, I was thinking about the case that you give on Argentina. And one of the things that it raised for me was thinking about the role of settler colonialism writ large, since that's sort of the issues of, the sort of conceptual category of settler colonialism has played such a big part in the literature in the last maybe decade or two. And so I really just wanted to get your thoughts on the extent to which you thought that that category of settler colonialism matters, and to what extent. Again, given, on one hand, cases such as Argentina, and then on the other hand, cases such as India, as Nigeria, but then some of your other cases as well, even when you think about the United States. Most of what I've said, I guess, sort of seems to be focusing on British imperialism, but certainly if you think about your American cases as well. And sorry, that's a section of the book where you focus a lot on third world nationalisms, so in Vietnam, in Iran, in Egypt, in the British side as well. So, and in Chile, I suppose. So I'll just close there again by just saying thanks very much for the ideas you developed in this book. And thanks very much to the organizers for the opportunity to share a few thoughts on them. Thanks.
Thank you, Jason. Right under 9 minutes. That was perfect. Okay, next we turn to Katrina. Katrina?
Thanks. And thanks to Nitsan for organizing and inviting me to comment on Atul's book. And thank you, Atul, for writing this book, and to Patrick for moderating. As you've probably already noted, this book is quite an accomplishment. And since Atul summarized the key and important themes, I'll just quickly say that I found it to be a very enjoyable read, and enjoyable to make sense of the cases alongside one another. And I think that anybody interested in global history, broadly writ, would find this to be the case. As you gathered probably from the great slides, the overarching argument is clear and parsimonious, and it's certainly a book worth reading. That being said, as a critic, I have a few reflections and questions for the author, which I'm sure he's thought about in great detail in the process of researching and writing this book. So I'll keep my remarks to 3 main points. The first is about the challenges of balancing historical narrative and general theory. The second is about deconstructing the nation and national sovereignty. And the third is about how to understand the motives for imperialism. So first, on historical narrative and general theory. While the author's goal is to present general theory, which is helpful for making sense of the many cases together, this approach necessarily sacrifices some detail, as we all know, as we all face these choices in our own research. So since we face these choices in our own research and writing, I'm curious if Atul could speak a bit to how he made the decisions that he did. And I want to focus on one consequence of choosing the general theory approach that kept coming up as I read the book, which is the interdependence of cases. And Jason raised a similar point about this, I think, regarding emerging nationalist elites. So I'll focus on metropolitan elites, that's what I study. As Atul noted in the book, what happened in one colony likely impacted the imperialist sense of what they could do in other territories, like what was going on in India impacted what they could do in China. So another way to think about the interdependence of cases would be to look at imperial inheritance and the relationship among empires. For example, when were the original conditions of the colony or the periphery set up? Does it matter, and how, that the United States inherited issues in Iraq left by the British, or in the Philippines and the Americas from Spain, or in South Korea and the Philippines from Japan, or the British inheriting issues from Spain or the Ottomans? What patterns of empire were set early on, and how were these taken up by new imperialists? And did this have an impact on their interventions? And I think a similar point that Jason raised is about how imperialists were often in conversation with one another. So it's hard to think about these as discrete cases. A second line of questions is, how is the US's way of empire, which Kohli defines as hard militarism, multilateral domination, and forced regime change, particular to the United States? Or is that an artifact of a changing global approach to intervention? What conditioned to the emergence of these strategies? In my estimation, and from parts of the book, it seems that multilateral domination and hard militarism emerged directly from a changing geopolitical terrain post-World War II. To be clear again, I'm not asking for you to answer all of these questions, but rather to speak to your decisions about how you discuss the interdependence of empires and how this fact impacts or not your overall argument. My second point is to raise the question of what is the nation and national sovereignty? Kohli argues that national sovereignty is an economic asset. At the same time, in his comparison of India and Nigeria, for example, he suggests that some of the seeds of successful nationalism, as Jason raised, are in colonial state building. And so for me, this raises the question of how we should deal with the fact of empire. First, the fact of European sovereignty was accomplished by asserting sovereignty over other territories. So how then can we understand colonial client or peripheral states' lack of sovereignty as an initial condition that enabled or disabled the incursion of imperial powers? Europe and the United States' relative level of development was predicated on the fact of empire. So does the lack of empire then damn countries like the Philippines, Nicaragua, and Nigeria to underdevelopment? To take this line of questioning a bit further would be to think about how we understand and explain development. So I cannot help but take issue when I read with the language of backward, especially used to describe Nigeria. And I raise this point not to bring needless focus to the word, but instead to interrogate how we study development and the normative Eurocentric assumptions that are wrapped up in that. what is backwardness meant to signal in this sense? Yes, the polities and the economies of many of these peripheral states were different from the United States and Britain, but are we supposed to judge them on a progressive unidimensional scale? In my read, the so-called backwardness or underdevelopment of some of these territories is an artifact of using European standards and definitions of the state, polity, and economy, when they themselves were built on and through imperialism. If then we take the language and the fact of imperialism, sorry, not the language, but the fact of imperialism seriously, which I think your book is really encouraging us to do, what does that mean for our language that we use to describe underdeveloped places? Second, if countries like the Philippines, Nicaragua, and Nigeria are not damned to underdevelopment because they lacked empires, but sovereignty, still the question remains of how we should understand national sovereignty. The national sovereignty of Britain and the United States were in fact what I think we could call imperial sovereignties. So questioning sovereignty requires interrogating the assumed national boundaries. I'll focus again on Nigeria, but I'll come back to this point later about the United States at the end of my remarks. So for now, what seems to damn Nigeria in the account in the book is decentralized rule, lack of sovereignty, and ethnic divisions. But these facts are only true if we see the modern state of Nigeria as a given. The Nigeria that's referred to in the book is not yet a crystallized nation state. And as Kohli notes, it was composed of the Sokoto Caliphate and the regions of the south, which were once the Oyo Empire, and then could be considered a number of warlords and traditional states, and Benin. So Nigeria's lack of coherent nationalism is an artifact of how nation states were created. So then who is to blame, so to speak? Not that this is the language that's used in the book, but who is to blame, so to speak, for the lack of a centralized state that did not fight off an enemy? Who are the people that we are assuming should be united? A final point on national sovereignty that returns to the comparison of India and Nigeria. Kohli suggests that more direct forms of colonialism can produce greater national sovereignty. And here, some of my comments dovetail with those made by Jason on his first point. So on the one hand, it gives fragmented elites something to join forces around, and on the other, direct rule can provide state structures and systems. How then should we make sense of the suggestion that more direct rule has positive outcomes for national sovereignty in light of some of the analysis of the US disastrous interventions in Vietnam and Iraq, for example? Okay, so finally, I want to talk about how to understand motives. So as by now it's clear, sorry, I see some nodding. As by now it's clear, the book argues that the motives for imperialism are economic. Although in today's slides, you did mention that the drive is both economic and political. So I'd be curious to understand I'd be curious to hear more about how you understand the political, which I think is a bit less stressed in the book than what you said today. But I certainly agree that the motives are political, as you'll see. So the focus on the book, I'm demonstrating this point throughout the book, that the motives are economic, necessarily means that there's less space to address the role of norms, missions, and ideals. How much does what imperial state actors say versus what they gain matter for understanding their motivations? Are norms and ideals superstructured, to use Marxist language, to economic interests? And how can we think of material consequences like economic growth as also explaining the cause or motivation for imperialism? Analytically, and at times in the presentation of the data, the explanandum and the exponand seem to overlap. The two might be linked, but that Britain and the United States benefited from imperialism doesn't always necessarily mean that's why they pursued it, which in fact, Kohli shows convincingly in the last chapters of the book. But how this fits with the larger theory remains unclear. As I raised earlier, how do we square the general theory with the post-World War II interventions, where Kohli says that the concerns about credibility in politics were increasingly important motivations? Is there something about the data from earlier time periods that makes it hard to assess the motivations for other interventions as so-called political? To be clear, I think this question about motivations is in particular to Iraq or Vietnam. Is it not possible that the United States or Britain, for that matter, had different motives in different eras or places? I do not doubt that the United States and Britain wanted power and sought this through economic interventions, but I also want to strongly push against the epistemological position that Kohli takes, where he says that the motivations for interventions ranging from 1898 to 2000 in the case of the United States did not vary. I think this is an empirical question that needs to be handled by exploring the tensions between what actors say and do and comparing this to other time periods. And from my perspective, actors in geopolitics change, so why wouldn't we expect motives to? And I think because I'm running out of time, I just want to focus this critique a little bit on the case of the United States and the US empire. Here I'm making a historiographic critique and leveraging it to raise questions about the importance of motives, particularly ones concerning race. In the book, Kohli repeatedly refers to the United States as an anti-colonial country, to its anti-colonial history, and to its preference for democratic rule. For me, as someone who studies US empire, the insistence on calling the United States anti-colonial is part of the US self-imagining and erasure of its own racial project, which matters for understanding the motivations for imperialism, or whether the US needs or wants imperialism, to put it in that language. The United States, before claiming the island colonies of Spain, which is where the book starts on the case of US imperialism, well, a little bit before that, but that's sort of the beginning chapters on the US. So the US, before claiming these island colonies, was already an empire. Why and how it conquered the continental territory of the United States shaped the continental boundaries, the national boundaries that we now take for granted. This point also relates to my earlier one about national sovereignty that I raised about Nigeria, and also to the point brought up about settler colonialism by Jason. So this project of continental conquest was profoundly motivated by the commitment to a white nation, albeit how US state actors sought to achieve these goals did change over time. To put this more in terms of your own argument, the motivation for US continental conquest may have been economic benefit of its nation or its national economic interest, but that nation, even before its founding, was always conceived of as a white one. Yet, in the book, it seems that race is thrown out as not sufficient motivation for imperialism, but I think this depends on how one conceives of race. If one thinks of racial motivations as synonymous with the white man's burden, the desire to conquer, to rule, to educate barbaric non-white masses of the world, then point taken. But racial motivations work in myriad ways. In the United States, concerns about advancing the white racial nation certainly motivated westward conquest. And in later periods, post-14th Amendment, which is for birthright citizenship, the commitment to a white nation limited the expansion and created opportunities for informal economic imperialism, which you document. So that was because the United States did not want to be faced with giving rights to Black and brown people of Mexico, the Dominican Republic, Panama, Central America, and the islands of the Pacific. So all of these things aside, I do want to say that this book is an important one to think with and through. And for me, it raised questions about how we study empire, development, and national sovereignty, as well as race. And I hope to hear more from Atul about how he wrestled with these questions in writing the book and presenting his general theory.
Thank you, Katrina. And finally, Sarah Babb. And Sarah, you're gonna share your PowerPoint with us, correct?
I am. Excuse me. Let's see, can you see that? No, you cannot. I need to share my screen. All right. Here. Okay.
Yep.
Yes?
Looks good.
All right. Excellent. I believe in images. So there you have it. I want to echo the other panelists in, thanking Nitsan and everybody who was involved in organizing this panel. It was a really great pleasure to read this book, and it's an honor to be able to comment on it. And I wanted to start out by saying how much I admire the way the book manages the problem of scope, because this is a really big project. This is 2 empires, more than 200 years, many countries, and this is not an easy thing to do. And I think that authors who are this ambitious tend to go overboard in one or the other of 2 ways. First of all, you have the authors who kind of go really meta-theoretical. I'm thinking about some of the work of Emanuel Wallerstein, where you read it and you don't really get much of a sense of the particular actors, the times, the places at all. So that's one side. And on the other side, there's the works that kind of lose their readers in a swamp of particular details. And maybe I'm the only one here, but this is always the way I experienced Barrington Moore's Social Origins of Dictatorship and Democracy. It was like, oh man, this detail and that detail. And yet somehow this book manages to trace a middle path where, yes, there's theory, and yes, there's an organizing principle, but it's mostly concentrated in the conclusion for interested readers. And there's also a lot of really good storytelling, a lot of juicy quotes. And I will say that for a book that is this big, and it is not a small book, it's a surprisingly fun read. So, I could even assign chapters of this book to undergraduates, which is certainly not true of Barrington Moore. So, excuse me. So when one is reviewing a book that takes on this much, I think that the path of least resistance is to complain about missing details. And, you know, and I'll sort of echo Katrina in saying that, you know, obviously you have to make choices about what details to include and not to include, and what distinctions to make and not to make. So, so with that in mind, I'm going to try to keep my questions broad, and I'm going to try not to get nitpicky, to be sort of true to the Weberian spirit of comparative and historical work. So my first question, and I think it's really interesting that Katrina raised this as well, is about the motivations of the imperial state. And my comments, I don't really know that much about British Empire, so I'm going to focus comments on American Empire. So this book, as we've heard, has this neo-Weberian view in which imperialism grows out of the modern state's vested interest in economic growth, which is very convincing to me. And the author writes, the pursuit of the national economic interest may sometimes coincide with the interest of few specific corporations, but not always, and maybe not even in most cases. So this is a very broad theory that facilitates comparison between these two different empires. It wonderfully deflates dominant ideas about the benevolence, particularly the benevolent role of the US in the world. And its main axis of distinction, I think, is between the formal and the informal empire. But in drawing attention to this distinction, it elides maybe some other distinctions, one of which I would like to highlight, which is this issue of motivation. And I think that this idea that imperial states pursue national economic prosperity includes a lot of different variations, and those you can see them in the book. And I think they're kind of worth teasing apart and theorizing a little bit more. And I'm sure that the author has thought about this and has really made an editorial choice to sort of set that aside in favor of other distinctions. But let me just say that there's at least two different interpretations that I see in this book. One is this direct economic interest, or what the author describes as a strong desire to create a global system of open economies in which their competitive firms can outsell others and or produce goods for others. And this is really exemplified by the Washington Consensus, where you have multilateral institutions, making it so that developing country governments have to sacrifice economic policy sovereignty in order to pursue policies that benefit US banks, portfolio investors, exporters, and so on and so forth. So that's one reading, right? The direct economic interests. But the other kind of motivation is this kind of long-term systemic interest that kind of has a different dynamic. And I think this includes a lot of America's foreign policy behavior during the Cold War, including the US war in Vietnam, right? When I look back on the Cold War period, I don't see the US government getting really into the nitty-gritty details of, we want you to do this with your trade policy, and we want to do this with your, you know, with your exchange rate policy. And it's sort of, they're pursuing the interests of the system in a way that's really different from what you see subsequently in the Washington Consensus. And I think which imperial motivation dominates at any particular time is consequential for the behavior of the empire and also for the developing countries that are living under it. So on the one hand, with the direct economic interests, well, that's going to severely constrain your development policy space. So that's a real cost for economic policy sovereignty. On the other hand, the latter kind of imperial motivation might not constrain your economic policy space as much, right? The risk is you get caught up in some horrible, bloody proxy war, but the benefit might be that you're able to kind of work within the system to get yourself more sovereignty. So this is sort of by way of saying, how does the author theorize these distinctions between different kinds of imperial motivation? So my second question, which is related, has to do with exceptions to the book's theorized relationship between imperialism and underdevelopment. And in particular, where do the so-called East Asian tigers fit into this story? Now, I know that the author has written extensively about these cases elsewhere, but in this book, Taiwan and South Korea are kind of more of an implicit control group, governments that were able to preserve economic policy sovereignty and therefore able to succeed in getting high quality development where other countries failed. The relevant comparison being Latin America, where countries like Brazil and Mexico pursued many of the same nationalist economic policies, right? If you look back at 1960, you compare Taiwan, South Korea on the one hand to Brazil and Mexico on the other hand, they don't look that different in terms of economic policy. You've got some state ownership of strategic industries, you have import substituting industrialization, you have some economic planning, but also a role for markets. But 20 years later, right, in 1980, 1985, they've got completely diverged. And those are very important differences because whereas East Asia was mostly able to avoid the Washington Consensus, as the author puts it, Latin America confronted it on bended knee. So how were South Korea and Taiwan able to pull this off? If American empire was detrimental to economic sovereignty and development overall, then how can we account for the economic sovereignty and development in Northeast Asia? I know of at least two different kinds of argument. One, which you can see in the work of Peter Evans, is that the East Asians did it better. They built more effective developmental states that were able to push beyond the easy phase of import substitution. And this kind of implies that, ooh, got it. If you're smart, or if you have the fortune to have good institutions in place to begin with, you can figure out a way to achieve high quality economic development as an imperial subject. The second explanation, which I think you can see in some of Robert Wade's work, is that Northeast Asia was able to leverage its strategic position to get a better deal from the Americans than Latin America ever got. And that implies that not all imperial subjects are treated equally, and that maybe some have more of prospect for sovereignty and development than others. So that I have a third question, but I didn't think I'd have time to make it, so I will leave it there. So I look forward to your response. Thank you.
Right, terrific. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Jason. Thank you, Katrina, for an extraordinary set of very rich and thought-provoking comments. So Atul, you now have a few minutes. I don't want to give you too many minutes because I'm sure the participants will also have some really interesting questions and comments. But let's give you the mic, as it were, and you can have a few minutes to respond before we open things up.
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you, all three of you. Those are terribly insightful comments. I appreciate them a lot. Too bad I didn't have them before the book was published, but there you have it. So thank you for reading and thinking about it. And it's the ultimate satisfaction for an author is to have bright people read the book and say, this is interesting, but that is a terribly good moment for an author to sort of face after a decade of work. So all of you, thank you deeply. The questions are rich. Patrick is a strict time manager, so I cannot answer all of them. Let me pick one from each and just sort of take 2 minutes per question and finish in 6 minutes. And in that way, we will have more time. And if others don't have questions, I can come back to those issues raised by the three discussants. Is that okay, Patrick? So Jason's question about nationalism, do nationalists have agency? Is nationalism mainly molded by type of imperialism? Those two are obviously related. Sort of, is it the structure of rule that creates a type of imperialism? And how much room do leaders have? And he's clearly thinking of India versus Nigeria because those are the examples he brought up. You know, in the India and Nigeria chapter, cohesion versus fragmentation is an obvious point that I developed, but it's not the only point. Implicit, and maybe I should have said it more strongly, is the time frame that India is ruled for nearly 2 centuries. And throughout the 19th century, higher education is brought to India in the middle of 19th century. And so by the end of 19th century, Indian leaders are studying in England already. That's not happening in Africa's cases till Second World War almost, you know, into the 1960s. So India had a lot longer period to develop its nationalism. And that adds to the sort of cohesive British colonialism that they need to fight. So over the 40, 50 years, they're able to pull together ethnic fragmentation. And in Nigeria, for example, things happen so quickly. Given another 40 years, would they have managed? Who knows that type of historical counterfactual? But it goes to the point of, you know, structural factor and agency, how the two marry or not marry. And in a sense, that question of Jason goes to Katrina's broader question, where she said, How do you marry historical narrative with general theory, right? It's a perennial problem. In a sense, Sarah Babb was also asking that question when she's positing Wallerstein and Moore and sort of saying she finds this level of detail more interesting. So this is a struggle. When you write a book like that, how much historical narrative is needed? And it's not just a matter of how much historical narrative. The instincts are different. The instincts of good history, and here I think is the most serious social science challenge for this type of scholarship. Let me just put it succinctly and then elaborate, is how to explain something without sounding that it was inevitable. That's the challenge. And if you have the mindset of a historian, you know that what happened was far from inevitable. There were so many forks in the road. And the social scientist mindset is to say, I got it. 3 variables and I got it. And social scientists fail because they cannot predict a damn thing, including the arrogant economists. So if you had a solid explanation, you would be able to predict. We don't do that very well. Problem with historians is they get so mired with forks in the road that they don't know which way is forward. And so detail overwhelms seeing some patterns. And this is a struggle nearly all of us do who comparative historical work and try to find some patterns and theory in it are constantly challenging, you know. And Katrina's point was very interesting. I may misstate it, but her suggestion was early imperialism might influence late imperialism. And in that sense, what Theda Skocpol had called world historical time in her States and Revolution book is a very important modification of the way Barrington Moore has juxtaposed cases as if they were silos next to each other. So Sarah Babb was getting at that too. And so the struggle of comparing cases, but also realizing some happened in 19th century, but some happening in 20th century. How do you have those silos, but also change over time? This is a very tricky intellectual task in comparative historical work. Just in defense of Barrington Moore, Sarah was a little down on him. I take him to be a model. So I'm sort of trying to copy. I take the criticism of Wallerstein, God rest his soul, you know, but Moore's work, same with his soul, they're both gone now. But Moore's work, I find a good place in terms of level of historical detail and general theory. And so I was trying to emulate that, but I was trying to argue against both methodologically and substantively with Wallerstein. Jason got that right, read that right, that is the main, if you like, one of the main intellectual targets of the book with a focus on state and power. Katrina raised important questions about motives, political versus economic, normative issues of how do you deal with issues of backwardness. I don't have time to go into all of those, but if I had time, I would love to have tackled them. I will take one question from Sarah on the exceptions in East Asia. And that's a very important point. I'm also in pretty comfortable grounds because, as you noted, I have written extensively on Japan, Korea in my other books. The main substantive empirical answer to your question, it's not a theoretical, it's an empirical issue, is I think United States understood Korea and Taiwan as mainly in Cold War terms. And in that sense, they made them military clients, but gave them economic autonomy. And in that sense, it was split sovereignty. It did not translate into political control aimed at economic benefit, because American game was a much larger economic game, which was to fight communism and preserve capitalism. And these were small pawns in that huge economic game. And so Korea's and Taiwan's had major military presence, but then let them do what they wanted to do economically. So Park would, essentially have nothing to do with USAID people who were sort of gave them nice lunches next door. US Embassy was next to the Blue House, but in the end would not allow them to influence economic plans. On the other hand, Korean military was totally, sort of under American influence and strategic planning vis-a-vis communism. So it's this split sovereignty, which I think helps us understand these exceptions of economic autonomy within an imperial framework. I'll stop there, Patrick.
Terrific. Thank you, Atul. Thank you to everyone. That was absolutely fantastic. We're going to open things up now. And what I'd like to suggest is that if you have a question, you could either turn your video on and wave, and I'll call on you, or you can use the raise hand function, which you'll find in the participants column, and signal that you would like to ask a question. And then I would ask that you simply unmute yourself and ask your question or make your comment. And since we have only 26 minutes, I would ask that everyone try to be as succinct as possible. So, questions? Not seeing any hands go up just yet, but I'll be patient for a little bit. And I'll warn everyone that if you don't jump in, I will. Well, while we give people time to maybe gather their thoughts, Atul, I can't resist two questions, inspired a bit by what some of the commentators have already said. A first question that builds on Jason's question, but also goes to Katrina's question, is about the economic versus other motives. And I take your point, and I think it's incredibly compelling, and I think Sarah said as much, that the book makes a very careful, very rigorous, very clear argument about economic motives as the national interests, and is a direct critique of more traditional reductionist Marxist arguments that imperialism is just a reflection of dominant class interests. And I think everyone who's read the book is going to be, deeply convinced by that argument. Having said that, is that still true? Thinking about the post-73 period, so thinking about the period that we now refer to as hyperglobalization, the argument that what's good for GE is good for America is just not true anymore. What's good for GE is to make stuff in China, and that clearly has not been good for American workers. And you could make an argument that the period of hyperglobalization isn't so much a reflection. I mean, it certainly reflects the policies of neoliberalism and open market economies that have been pushed by the US, but this doesn't really ultimately reflect the national interests. It reflects the interests of global finance and global multinational corporations, et cetera. Hence Trump, right? And hence Brexit, and hence all these nationalist populist movements that we're seeing rise up throughout the world. So it's more a provocation than anything else, but I'd love to get your take on that. And a second question has to do with, so you emphasize the economic motives, you also emphasize the economic effects. And it makes a lot of sense. The book is called Imperialism and Development. But I was a bit almost surprised, given all your past work and your interest in democracy and a very deep and abiding normative interest in democracy, that you didn't say more about the long-term effects of imperialism on politics and on democracy itself. One could make an argument, which would be, I think, completely aligned with your own argument, that if you want development, you got to get the politics right? And as you have emphasized time and time again, sovereignty leads to effective states, or sometimes is a necessary precondition for effective states. Effective states are a necessary precondition for development. But yeah, how do you build sovereignty? How do you build the nation if you've been colonized or you're subject to the fragmented forces of imperialism? So I know that's a point that you're not going to disagree with, but I just wanted to give you maybe the opportunity to think more or tell us a little bit more about your thoughts on how imperialism over the long term may undermine development, not so much through the economic mechanism as much through political mechanisms. And I'm looking to see if there's any hands raised, and I don't see any, and I don't see anyone waving. And if I'm missing something, guys, the rest of the panelists, let me know. Jason, Katrina, Sarah, maybe you'd like to jump in and expand on your comments or respond to Atul's responses to your comments. Sarah, I could see you itching to.
So yeah, thank you for that response. That sounds entirely credible to me, and I wish I knew more about that part of the world. But from what I've read, that sounds right. Can I ask another question? What about so I talked about two sort of versions in your book of economic interest. The sort of direct and then the systemic economic interest. But what about when the state is taken over by sort of loot and pillage rent-seeking interests? What do you make of the era of Donald Trump and American imperialism? Yes, different kind of thing.
I don't understand that question.
It seems like Donald Trump represents a third kind of economic interest, which is to say, very particularistic interests that they're not sort of it's not the executive committee of the bourgeoisie anymore. It's something that's metastasized and perhaps is incompatible with empire. So yes.
Jason and Katrina, or anyone else, before we hand things back to Atul, do you want to jump in? So Atul, you have a new set of questions on the table and some other questions that you might want to return to that you weren't able to cover in your initial response.
Thank you, Patrick. Yeah, I'm happy, since I wrote a long book, I could go on, but I don't want to lose all your interest either. So I think the key question, which several of you have asked, is how do you make sense of motives? And what is the underlying theory? And people obviously are not always persuaded by my argument. So, Katrina suggested, is it possible that there are different motives during different time periods? Sarah suggested that the IMF type of minutiae sort of details of economic policy management elsewhere strike her as very different type of imperial extension compared to a Vietnam, much more blunt, militaristic type of intervention. So how do we square that circle in a general theory, so to speak? And Patrick said, okay, supposing even if you're right about economic motives being important, and what was good for General Motors or General Electric, whichever your favorite corporation, is good for America, that doesn't hold true anymore because we're in a globalized world, and these corporations operate everywhere, and it's not clear what is in their interest. So does this argument still hold? So all of these questions are getting at, and I think some of it was evident in Jason's question too about agency. So It is, as you can imagine, over a decade, I thought long and hard about question of motives. And the struggle was that in many cases, strict Marxist argument does hold. So in about good 30% of my cases, you can really see imperialism driven by narrow corporate capitalist interests. In about 25% of the cases, you could make the suggestion that imperialism, such as in Vietnam, possibly in Iraq, Britain and the Ottoman Empire, that these were really security-driven sort of issues, whether it's Cold War or management of different imperial sort of agendas. And in about half the cases, what I was suggesting, that it's the coincidence of interest between what's good for capitalism as well as what's good for state power are sort of fit neatly. So if this was a statistical exercise, you would get some sort of, variation explained, which would follow these rough approximate percentages that I'm throwing out. So my solution to my variables and historical forces moving in slightly different direction across cases was to have a looser theory. So tighter theory would have said it's moved by security. A tighter Marxist theory would have said it's moved by capitalist interest. And because I've tried to combine the two, my umbrella fits the cases, but it's not as tight. And that is a perennial dilemma for trying to marry sort of data with theory, whether it's comparative historical data or statistical data for that matter, So that was the struggle. In terms of Patrick's specific question, is the argument still hold? I think the argument still holds. I think because we have gone from emphasis within the American economy has shifted from corporations like General Electric to finance. And finance has a much more sort of fluid playing field in the world. And so globalization is really much more about finance than it's about trade and investment. And in that sense, pursuit of financial interest, whether it was through the Washington Consensus and you needed multilateral domination, to get Latin America to pay its debts back, something Sarah has written with her co-author, I think is a real example of how these tendencies are manifesting even in the sort of post-1973 world. The modalities have changed, the motives have not changed. And I think importance of finance is extremely important for understanding the nature of modern imperialism. And it sort of goes back to, in that context, I want to go back to Katrina's question about multilateralism. She felt American multilateralism is really a post-World War II phenomenon. I want to push back on that sort of. If you go back to how America's China policy came about after the Spanish-American War and how US created the open door notes, open door policy notes in China. It was a classic case of multilateral domination. They cooperated with Britain as well as with implicitly, as well as with other powers, Japan and Germany, to carve China up into an open market. So it almost reminds one of US working through the IMF to get debt paid back from Latin America. In the early part of the 20th century, it was to open it up for trade and investment. Finance was not as important, but what you notice is an implicit cooperation among imperial powers to carve China into pieces of lemon, as the Chinese history tells us. So I think that's where the original idea for multilateral domination came. I would date it to that. I think the ideas that came during Second World War to create a sort of World Bank, IMF institutions, the Bretton Woods types of institutions, the seeds of that go back much earlier. They go back to at least the open door notes. And I think sort of was Appleman William, I think, who had made the original argument that that was the framework. I think it is still a very important grain of truth. I was greatly influenced by his student Walter Lefebvre's work, which I cite to sort of great extent on the early historical American chapters.
Atul, I think Jason wanted to jump in with a question, and again, just to remind everyone that you can raise your hand if you want to get into the conversation. Jason?
And Patrick, I will come back to your democracy question in a minute after Jason.
Okay, great.
Okay, thanks, Patrick. Yeah, so so this question is kind of inspired by Atul's responses and highlighting the importance of time frame on one hand, and I guess periodization. But then also Sarah's question about sort of Trump and sort of thinking about contemporary imperialism. And so at first I was going to think about ask about the US, but actually it might be more interesting to think about perhaps the new imperial power, perhaps China. And so I'm just curious, how might you extend your argument to think about what China is doing now globally? So the two big things that of course come to mind are China and Africa on one hand, in terms of the mode of economic expansion, let's say, especially in East and Southeast Africa, but really across much of the continent. But then also the Belt and Road Initiative as well. So it's expansion across Asia, and it's sort of restructuring perhaps and deepening of its relationships with a whole host of countries across the entire Asian continent, from Southeast Asia through South Asia and so forth. I'd just love to get your thoughts.
Patrick, should I respond?
Yes, absolutely.
All right. So a couple of questions on the table, which I have not addressed. Patrick's question about democracy, Sarah's question about Trump, and now Jason Jackson's question about China. Let me take them in those order they were brought up. Patrick's question, what about political effects? How come I have not paid more attention to it? I think that's a valid point. It is missing in this book. And I think the answer is, it depends on how high you're flying in terms of what all you can cover and what all you see. So this book is aimed at showing importance of sovereignty more than within sovereign states, the political forms that emerge. So if folks are interested in what I have to say, you can read this and state-directed development as back-to-back complementary books. This book is both historically and analytically prior. It talks about sovereignty being important, and then given sovereignty, when do you get an effective state or when you don't? And how democracy fits into that are sort of continuous arguments. I was unable to compress that argument into this argument. And in a sense, that also answers Sarah's question about East Asian exceptionalism. That is addressed in that book on state-directed development. So had I thought of this book, I would have written this first and would have written state-directed development second, but I didn't think of it that way. So I wrote state-directed and then I wrote this, but the two really do hang together analytically at least. Sarah's question on Donald Trump raises the broader point of what do you do when metropolitan countries where one expects institutional politics themselves fall prey to personalistic politics. And the answer is that personalistic politics is not likely to develop institutional long-term trends that are worthy of real social science analysis. if this becomes a trend in the US, then we are in a whole different ballgame. What type of imperialism we will see. Then, we may see where Trump's economic family interests are. Sort of, he excuses those countries as, as bad countries. So we may see a whole different pattern of intervention. But my best guess is that in a highly institutionalized metropolitan capitalist country like the United States, this will be a blip, and we will return to our bad old imperial tendencies, and we will call it global internationalism, and the whole democratic crowd that supports, will be back, and they all are much more decent looking, but from the point of view of developing countries, they're lethal, that they sort of support finance capital, and we will be back, at where it was. Let's try and collect our debt or whatever other type of intervention that is needed. Finally, on Jason Jackson's question on China, as you know, Jason, the book ends with speculating about China. That's the last part of the book. And I make a distinction between China creating economic dependencies, but China not developing an informal empire. And that distinction rests on use of coercion, because coercion is very important in my definition of what an informal empire is. So I'm trying to distinguish. Simply having economic asymmetry is not imperialism in my definition. So economic asymmetry, when it is backed by force, that it becomes a type of informal empire. And in that sense, China has created enormous economic dependencies in Africa, but so far has not used force. And it's not out of goodness of their heart. It's just either they don't have the throw capacity or they're worried about reaction to it. They're also dealing with sovereign states, and the power gap is not that giant, right? You simply get, for example, the election back of Mahathir, and he redoes the economic contract between Malaysia and China. This is tiny Malaysia, right? So even the giant China could not impose an economic contract sort of on Malaysia. And Pakistan may do that too with a different leader. It is the case that in Sri Lanka, they did come close to exercising informal empire when they took over the port. And that is a type of debt trap diplomacy, which I characterize as informal empire in the Washington Consensus period between US and Latin America. That's the closest China has come to looking like an economic empire. It's an informal empire. But in Africa, for the most part, they have created enormous dependencies so far.
So we're almost out of time, Atul, but I know Katrina has a question. Katrina?
Yes, I think that this will take longer than for you to answer than the few minutes that are left, but I was sort of wanted to pull together some of the threads about your response to motives and talking about the necessary and sufficient conditions in a way which I think Patrick raised again. So I think, the book does this wonderful job, as Sarah noted, of talking about a range, like sort of a range of cases and a range of motives we could even think that aren't necessarily parsed out. And so in providing the umbrella theory, I think there's sort of an impetus here, or a call for people following on the work to think through what are the necessary and sufficient conditions for a certain type of intervention or for a certain kind of transition from when does informal, so for example, the post-World War II transition. It's not as if, to your point, informal empires did not exist before, but there's a shift, right, in the dominant approaches. And so what are the conditions that necessitate that? And I'm sure from your decade of research on this, you would have much to say, but I don't know if we really have time. But that's something that I've been thinking about, that there's sort of a lot of data here to think through those questions. And I'm curious what you would say about what you found in your comparison of these cases across time periods.
Do we have time, Patrick?
But very quickly, because I do want to take a minute or two to just properly thank everyone, and I'm sure that people will be signing out. So a minute.
It's a interesting and complicated question about the conditions. I I don't have a short answer, Katrina. It's a much more, I have discussed it at some length in the concluding chapter, and I think the key insight that emerges is they try formal empire, but they back off when they are pushed back. And they're pushed back either because of global constraints, because other powers are interested, or indigenous forces are able to push back. So the condition for informal empire, I don't think emerges from the nature of economic interest. It emerges more from political constraints for going forward with colonial type of empire. That's the instinct that runs through that issue.
Great. Thank you, Atul. So we're just about out of time, and I do want to monopolize the last 2 minutes to just give thanks to all those who made this event possible, starting with Nitsan, who I think has left us, but Nitsan Korev, who not only has taken on the extraordinary responsibility of being president of SASE and organizing this conference in these truly extraordinary times, but also putting this panel together. And I also want to thank the staff at SASE. For those of us who followed the emails and all the instructions, it's amazing how professional and how efficient they've been. And obviously this went beautifully, and they're doing this over and over again over the next 3 days. So many thanks to the staff at SASE and everyone who's made this possible. And then to Jason and Katrina and Sarah, that was absolutely, oh, hi Nitsan, good to see you. That was absolutely fantastic. Normally I'd like to do other things on Saturday, but this was as fun and exciting as it gets. And then finally, Atul, thank you first for writing an incredibly important book. I think, everyone's on this panel, everyone who's read the book, everyone who knows knows your work. It just deeply appreciates how much work and thought you've put into this. I mean, your last response on methods and trying to balance empirical detail and historical complexity with parsimony, we all struggle with that. And the way you've structured and argued this book, I think really just stands as a beautiful example of how to deal with really complex material in a deeply thoughtful and theoretically powerful way. So, sadly, most of us, I suspect, are going to be indoors more than we'd like to be for the next few months or the next year for that matter. So, if you haven't already gotten your copy of Imperialism in the Developing World, now's a great time to do it. There's much to be learned from this book. Thank you all. That was really super exciting. Thank you, Nitsan. Stay safe, everyone, and I can't wait for November 3rd.
Can I just, since you brought up my name, I wanted to also personally thank you, Patrick, and Atul, of course, and Sarah and Jason and Katrina, who gave us wonderful view of a wonderful book. So thank you all for making this happen. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.